Alright, first I'd like to say thank you to all of you guys. I'm new to the Conlang community, but I've been creating constructed scripts for English for a long time. You guys are giving me the warmest welcome possible. Thank you all. So, I'm Jasper Danielson, and I'm going to be talking about the art and science of constructed scripts. But first, let's take a look at some scripts. These are scripts that I pulled from Omnibot, which I'm going to make, first of all, right here, a shameless plug for. Omnibot.com is a great place to look for scripts for inspiration of all forms for your Conlangs. So this is just a very small tip of the iceberg of the massive variety of constructed scripts that are out there. These are actually just scripts for English because that's where I like to look on that website. And if you actually check out that website, you will find my own personal script. Ryonic is the second script on the website under the English conscripts. So, but by the end of the presentation, I will be showing you guys a little bit of Ryonic and the whole script family there. All right. So first of all, why should you create a constructed script? Now, there are a number of reasons why you might want to create a constructed script. First of them is the most obvious here, as pertaining to a Conlang. Adding a constructed script adds sort of a depth to the language. You can use it to sort of emphasize historical or social history of the society, of the con world that you created. You can create multiple scripts, script families, evolutions of scripts, different varieties, all the same things that you can do with a Conlang. It's just a written version of the language instead of a spoken version of the language. Also, the constructed script often serves as the most public face of a Conlang because unless people are actually listening to you speak it or to somebody else speaking your language, what most people are going to actually see is the written form. That's the first exposure a person gets to most other Conlangs. And so the proper choice of a conscript is very important because it can either enhance the Conlang or a poorly chosen conscript can detract from the appeal of the Conlang. So one particularly successful example of Conlang is, of course, Tolkien. Tolkien created a number of constructed scripts for his various languages. I'm sure you guys are familiar with a few of these. Some of the most famous of these, Tengwar. I don't exactly know how to pronounce the rest of those, so I'll try. But he created all of these scripts. He created whole histories of them, when they were created, who they were created by, different older versions. He created a vast network of these scripts to match the vast complexity of this language. I feel that I would sort of say that all Conlang should have sort of this complexity with the written form, because in real societies as well, as there is evolution of the spoken form of the language, there's also an evolution of the written form of the language. So, but this is only one reason why you might want to create a constructed script, and I'd like to talk about a few of these. Another one is for auxiliary scripts. You can look at, of course, the most successful is the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet. That is a constructed script that was created a long time ago, that is used, as you guys all know, it's widely used as standard linguistics. But there are a number of other systems like the IPA that attempt to create sort of universal spelling, universal alphabets here. You've got Interbet, which is sort of a more practical version of IPA that has fewer actual symbols, but that can actually represent all the languages of the world, like IPA. And there's Universal Phonetic Alphabet, which didn't like the fact that IPA basically uses alphanumeric. Didn't think that was international because that's clean. So these are just a few of the examples of international alphabets that have been created for this purpose. Another reason you might want to create a constructed script is to sort of optimize the process that we already use scripts for. One example of this is Shorthand Scripts. Probably the most famous is Greg Shorthand, although Pittman Shorthand is also quite popular. And these are essentially to reduce written language to the most basic components of it so you can write it as fast as possible. Greg Shorthand, I believe the record for transcribing speech with Greg Shorthand was something in the ballpark of 400 words per minute. Greg Shorthand is amazing at doing this. It is over in all of this. But the idea is that you can use scripts to optimize otherwise inefficient processes. And writing is just one of these. You can also use it to create scripts that are easier to read. Scripts that flow easier on the eye, that condense information and express information in such a way that you can pull out the relevant information of the sentence more easily than in your standard scripts. You can design scripts to make these processes more efficient. And the shorthand is just one. You might want to also make scripts for a bunch of non-linguistic uses, although a lot of people don't, for the most part, do these things. So these actually are not constructed scripts in the strict sense of newly constructed scripts. These are sort of the standard form of these things. You've got your mathematical shorthand, which is just standard. There's only one variety of it. Although if you have time at the end of the presentation, I'd like to talk about a little bit of con mapping that I've been doing. Writing my own constructed mathematical script, which reflects that. But also musical notation. If music is important to the society that is part of your con world, then you might want to consider having a constructed musical script. And of course, there's computer programming, which is, you never want to use that language, by the way. But computer programming is a form of constructed script, though it's almost all of them are based on alphanumeric. Though there are a variety of rare programming languages that use other scripts. They're primarily based on natural scripts. And finally, you can use constructed scripts for sort of educational purposes. It's a novel way to sort of introduce young children to the idea of studying language, not just studying scripts, but conscripts are an easy way to introduce students to studying both natural and constructed languages. It's also been proposed that you can use constructed scripts as a way to actually, like very, very young, first and second grade, to introduce students to just writing as a whole. Because the English writing system is, as we know, sort of imperfect. There's no sort of phonetic matching in the English system, not nearly as clean as you can make a constructed script. You can make a sort of clean or more perfect constructed script. It's easier to teach the children. It teaches them the fundamentals of phonetics that then would, hypothetically at least, make it easier for them to learn the regular writing system. And then, of course, if you teach this to students that are slightly older, this could, as I said, encourage them to go learn Spanish, French, or a Conlang if they're interested in that. So this is recruiting for Conlang. This is the easy way to go about it, because it's a lot easier to teach a conscript than a Conlang. There are not nearly as many. There's only a few letters in a conscript for most of them, where there are many, many more words. All right. So now I'd like to sort of decide and look at the neuroscience of language, because this can help us understand the relationship between, what I'd like to look at is the relationship between the visual processing of language, auditory, and then our own speech pathways, our own production of speech. And the way that these pathways work together is very important for understanding of why we should make constructed scripts, how we should make constructed scripts, and how we should make them in particular so that they match the other forms of language that are used. So, as I said here, there are a number of connections between how we process written language, spoken language, and then how we create our own pathways of speech. This is also tied in with other processes of the brain, including personification, identification of people, and emotion. And we all, as Conlangers, can play on this connection to create sort of more custom scripts, more naturally scripts that better match the constructed language that you guys have all created. You can use these techniques to sort of fine-tune your script to fit your language. So first, I'd like to sort of sidetrack here and look at a disorder known as synesthesia. It's also known as ideesthesia. It's a slightly different variant, but for our purposes, it's the same thing. It's a neurological disorder where, well, actually, it's a variety of things. It's essentially where any one sense is paired with another. But the most common forms of this are where people associate either phonemes or graphemes or some linguistic component with another sensory experience. People can be reading a script and have a color experience, or even in very rare forms of this, a taste experience. People can literally taste words. This is relatively common, especially in the grapheme color form of this. It's relatively common. So where people will identify a color with each individual letter, usually. But the interesting thing about this is that it's not entirely a sensory phenomenon. That's why grapheme color would probably be more correctly categorized as ideesthesia, which is ideas mapping to senses instead of senses mapping to senses. Because people can just think about letters, can just think about sounds, and they still have these color experiences with this particular disorder. And there's also a slightly more rare form that's slightly more fun to talk about, called ordinal linguistic personification, where people associate letters or sounds or phonemes, graphemes, whatever you want to call them, with actual personalities. And I'd like to show a quote from somebody that happens to have this form of synesthesia. I'll read a lot. T's are generally crabbed, ungenerous creatures. U is a soulless sort of thing. 4 is honest, but 3 I cannot trust. 9 is dark, a gentleman, tall and graceful, but politic under his suavity. So, this is just one example, and I hope a humorous one, of sort of what synesthesia is. It's the idea, or ideasthesia is that they have these sensory experiences that are not mapping exactly to the things that they should be mapping in the brain. So I'd like to look at, well, before I get there actually, I'd like to point out I am a synesthete. I have grapheme color synesthesia. But I'd like to convince all of you that you are also synesthetes. This has been shown with sort of a classic experiment. There's 2 forms of it. There's the Kiki Bouba effect, which is these 2 shapes. I'll talk about it. And there's also another form, Takete and Bouba, that have been paired with a very similar experiment. Based on a classic 1929 psychology experiment where experimenters basically presented subjects with shapes like these, gave them 2 shapes and 2 names, and told them to match the names to the shapes. And you get 95 to 98% agreement across subjects that the shape on the left is Kiki or Takete, and the shape on the right is Bouba or Manuma. And so this effect shows that this isn't just unique to sort of your normal classified synesthetes. Everybody has this. They have this sort of pairing between what should just be, I mean, you're just reading those letters on the screen, you're just reading K-I-K-I, B-O-U-B-A, but you're matching that with a shape. That seems weird. I can understand mapping those to sort of a vocal experience, a understanding what the speech is, but you're mapping them to a shape that seems like sort of odd connection, but this is very widespread. You see, basically everybody has this effect. And further experiments have shown that this is actually inborn. This is an inborn capability. This occurs in children under the age of 2 that have not yet learned how to write. So this is not related to our exact knowledge of the writing system, but this is when they spoke the words Kiki and Bouba, they matched them with roughly the same accuracy as adults who have learned to read did. This is clearly sort of pre-writing in people. This is inborn capability. So I'd like to look at why this happens and how you all, as a group, can place this with your concepts. So, as you all know, language is complex, and neuroscientifically it's very complex. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. I just want to cover bases here because this is what I'm talking about for a little bit. Our understanding of language is the integration of a number of different pathways, in particular these 4. You have the auditory pathway, where you listen to speech and you process that, and somehow you get from sound waves to ideas in your brain that are running around. You somehow encode the sound that's coming in through your auditory system and get meaning out of it. The second form is visual. This is for written language. This is for scripts of a variety of forms. Then there's the vocal system, which is our creation, our formation of new words in our mind. When we want to say something, our vocal system has to sort of first produce that sound, produce that idea, convert the idea that we have running around in our heads into a word. And finally, there's the motor system that essentially allows us to, the motor system is sort of our output where we actually talk instead of just talking in our heads. And this is actually something that will come again, is subvocalization is the process, is where I don't know how to put this exactly, but the voices in your head, when you're forming speech, if you can talk in your head without actually saying it out loud. I don't know how to say this without you guys, unless you guys just understand this. Is subvocalization is everybody does it. Particularly good way of demonstrating this is when. Particularly good way of demonstrating this is when people read. 95% of people, when they read, pronounce the words sort of in their head as they're reading. There is a small group of people that reads without actually processing the sounds of the words, but just converts from the visual to the ideas. But a vast majority of people actually convert from visual stimulus to sort of a subvocalization, and then convert from that to meaning. People are better at understanding the spoken form. The reason this happens is all these pathways get integrated in this area called Wernicke's area, which is approximately here on our brains. And this is the region of our brain that's responsible for our understanding of the meaning of different components of language. It's sort of in this region of our brain, we have sort of mappings from words, already pre-processed words, to the ideas that those words correspond to. And this is in all humans. This Wernicke's area is what's responsible for that final stage of processing once you've integrated all of our auditory, visual, all of our different forms of input, and integrates it into a final meaning of the word that is actually in a language our brain can understand. And this, as I said, integrates all these different pathways. But because it integrates all those pathways, it's not just entirely an input system, it also outputs signals back into those pathways. So when you read, as I was saying, when you read something, it goes through your visual system, goes to Wernicke's area, but then it also sort of shoots on to the vocal system. So you do get a sub-vocalization phenomenon when you're reading visual words. And also, when people are speaking, this is slightly more controversial, but when people are speaking, there's sort of an idea that we have at least some of the fundamental shapes of the letters often. This isn't always, that sort of run through sub-visualization, which is sort of a hard thing to quantify, but sub-visualization is also one of these pathways here. But the idea is that because of Wernicke's area, you can experience language in any one of these, through any one of these four pathways, essentially three because you can't experience language through the motor system. But then that experiencing it in any one of these will make it so that you experience it in multiple of these or even all of these different pathways. Now, so what does this mean for constructed scripts, and more importantly, for constructed languages? This means that spoken and written language is connected. That certain written features so you can say that certain written features can accentuate certain features of spoken language. There might be certain shapes on paper that do correspond to different spoken phonemes that we use. So you can define a potentially more natural looking script for your Conlang based on the particular phonemes that your Conlang includes. So here I'd like to make a little bit of a disclaimer here, because I'm only going to talk about linear scripts, although these lessons are applicable to all sorts of scripts. And I can show an example of an awesome non-linear script called Circular Gallifreyan that was created for Doctor Who here. Just an example of something that you can do that is a non-linear writing form. There are all sorts of non-linear writing forms, but still a vast majority of writing systems, over 90% of writing systems, are linear in some form. It can be left to right, right to left, top to bottom, bottom to top, whatever it is. You can set it diagonal, by all means. But linear scripts are what I'm going to focus on in this, but the lessons here are applicable to all sorts of other scripts. So there are a number of script features, of different features of the letters and of the script as a whole that I'm going to look at and talk about sort of how they correspond to the different spoken language components. First of all, I'd like to look at sort of the fundamental set of features that we have when we're processing written language. We have here the curve, the point, the dot, and the line, and I'll explain these more as we get to them, show examples and everything. But sort of psychological and neuroscientific research has shown that these are the fundamental shapes. Any other shapes that we perceive are sort of combinations of these shapes put together in more complicated symbols. An example of this processing is this is one way of conceptualizing the pathway that visual information takes in our brain when we're processing sort of speech in this way. That you see this diagonal letter B, it goes to, and you sort of get this. We don't have a perfect visual system, so we don't actually see the line. We see a bunch of pieces of information here, and then when they get pieced together, we see what our brain actually sees is the line and the curve. The connections are also important, but we do see, in particular, this shape and this shape. That's what B, the letter B in this particular case, gets broken down into. So, without further ado, lines. I'd like to look at the use of lines. This might seem like a basic thing, but lines are, you do want to use lines in different places than you might want to use curves, dots, points, etc. Lines, our brains are very, very good and very fast at processing lines. If you look at the amount of reaction time that takes somebody to process, and this wasn't conducted with language, this was just conducted with sort of random shapes. that people are very fast at processing lines, and it takes about 3 times as long to process a curve. We're still talking in the order of very few milliseconds to do this total, but there is still some processing time. So if you create a script that, say you create a script that's entirely composed of these lines and very few curves, is that this is going to be a very fast to read script. It's because our brains can process, actually can encode the fact that that's a line very easily, because our brains need to encode that it's a line before they can encode that that's part of a letter. So just a small bit of encoding time can speed up the written form of your language. And also, lines in particular contribute to the perceived flow or lack of flow in your script. I'll get to more examples later, but just know that sort of the lines that you include, if there's an overarching pattern of those lines, sort of an alignment of lines in your script, and that will give your script an overall flow. If you have a lot of horizontal lines and doing a left-to-right script, then it will flow very smoothly from left to right, and the eyes will follow that very quickly. If you have something that's a bunch of vertical lines, then it will be a very halting, slow script that is viewed as being complex. And if you have slanted forms, then the eyes will essentially do this on the text. Will essentially zigzag back and forth as they follow the shape up and then reset. So it's sort of in between that. And so because these are very quick to visually process, they are best paired with short or abrupt phonemes. Now let me explain this for a bit. I'm going to talk about it later with the other shapes as well. Is that the time that you take to process these individual shapes, I mean, even these individual components of letters, the time that you take to process those shapes is time that you are essentially spending in farther down the pathway, but that you're spending in the vocal system sub-vocalizing this. So that if you have a letter an individual letter, a grapheme that takes less time to process, then you're going to spend less time actually sub-vocalizing that particular phoneme. And so if you have particular phonemes that are pronounced very fast in your language, or that, if you have phonemes that are particularly fast in your language, then you might want to consider having your letters maybe not entirely be composed of lines or straight lines, but you should sort of lean towards using lines in those particular characters. Now for curves are sort of the opposite of lines in this circumstance. Sorry for using the word class pattern, just to explain that. That's essentially the neuronal process that we're using to process these shapes. And that's saying that circular shapes take longer to process. And because of that, it concentrates our eye movements on those shapes. If you have curves in your letters, your eyes are going to spend a slightly higher percentage of their time looking at the curves. It's going to sort of create an emphasis effect on those letters. So in contrast to straight lines, curves are best used with sort of longer sounds because of that concentration effect. You spend 3 to 4 times as long processing the curve as you're going to spend 3 to 4 times longer in your mind sub-vocalizing that particular sound, syllable, phoneme, whatever it is. And thus, if you have a longer syllable, you might want to play on that so that you are sub-vocalizing that syllable for longer just naturally. And now for points. Points are sort of a compound shape here, but they are still a fundamental shape in terms of our perception. Is that points are essentially looking like that. I'm sorry for the distinction between points and dots. That's what's in the literature. So when it's isolated, when that particular shape, when there are no other lines that are surrounding it, then points are essentially treated as a line in context. It will be treated as sort of as a vertical line here. That's how our brains will immediately process this, because we don't, even though we do spend some processing time on, we do spend some processing time on these shapes, we don't spend a ton of processing time on them. And so that will just get approximated in our brain essentially as a vertical line with a horizontal line connecting whatever was previously connected above. When it's surrounded by other features, however, it takes on those particular qualities, the qualities of those other features. So I like to look at a few examples here. In alphanumeric, your capital A has a point on the top. Since that is isolated, we treat that sort of, in our very quick visual processing, we treat that as a vertical line. Even though we do still see those other lines, but that we see the slanted line here, the slanted line here, slanted line here, those two intersections. But then we also see that point on the top that essentially accentuates the fact that it comes to a point on the top to provide sort of a mental vertical line, a vertical shape to the letter A there. Whereas the letter M, because that point in the middle, this font didn't do it very well, but that point in the middle is sort of surrounded by those other shapes, by those other curves in particular, then the line in the middle of, the point in the middle of an M doesn't get treated as a vertical line. It doesn't this font, sorry about that. But it does not get treated as a vertical line in that way. It gets treated sort of as another curve. The way we process that in the most immediate sense would be something that looks sort of like that. And that's sort of our first layer processing of the letter M. And finally, dots. They're technically not a feature of their own, but they're still very important. Because it does not, dots are essentially treated as low density or textured lines connecting to whatever they're near. Because the dots still exist as dots. They're different than actually having a line there, but not in the sense of how we perceive the letter. If you were to talk about perceiving the letter as an overall vertical shape or horizontal shape, just sort of what I'm talking about here, dots don't affect that other than creating a new line from the dot to the nearest shape. If you have two dots, if you've got an umlaut, for example, that would be sort of treated as a horizontal line and then connected to whatever your shape is. In terms of construction, if you're looking at the principles of lines, curves, and points, that's how dots are treated. However, they do change sort of the perception of, change the perception of the character, but only in sort of subtle ways that are hard for me to quantify in this presentation, so I suggest that you experiment, or to make another shameless plug for Omniglot, look at Omniglot and look at a lot of scripts on Omniglot. There are lots of dots used in diagnoses at various forms there. Finally, there are sort of compound shapes made from intersections of lines and curves. I just got three types here. You've got, and they're what they sound like: L intersection, T intersection, X intersection, where, I don't know how to say that more clearly than that. We've got one that's just an angle, a sharp angle that's not quite narrow enough to be a point. You've got a T, where it's a three-way intersection. You can have a four-way intersection. But this provides, just like a curve, this provides a focal point or emphasis for visual processing. Is that, and then also, along this line, you increase in sort of the complexity of the intersection, at least to our first layer of visual processing. So you increase the amount of focal time that your eye spends on it, the amount of emphasis that letter has, and again, you can use this to essentially create more intersections, more curves for letters that correspond to sort of longer phonemes. You can use this to build that emphasis. Next, I'd like to look at density alignment. As I said before, I was going to come back to this. Is that our eye movements sort of follow the alignments of different script features. And this can be used to create a sense of movement in your writing. This does deal a lot on the font level and less on the script level, but still you can design your script in such a way that it does play on this effect. Your script might not have a general alignment of line features, but if it does, then it will have the kind of effects. I showed 4 here. Notice the one on the right, this is actually a vertical script. So the horizontal lines are actually making it a slower and more halting script, which might be the effect that you're trying to achieve. But if it's not, you should try to avoid that because you can sort of prevent the reader from reading it as smoothly as they otherwise would be able to. And then a script like this, which is where the lines are lined up slanting forward, or scripts like that one there where they're slanting downward, allow you, as I said before, cause your eyes to move along with that shape, to move along with that alignment until it reaches the bottom of the word, and then it goes back up. This form of writing is probably the most common here, with some form of general slanted alignment, because it allows the eyes to approach the writing at probably the most natural pace. You could say that's sort of how English functions, but alphanumeric. But alphanumeric does have a lot of other things to it. There are also scripts that don't have this alignment at all. But if you do have this alignment, be conscious of what it's doing to the flow of your writing. This bottom one here is Apple Beach from Omniglot. And this one is more emphasizing the third bullet point I have here, that low feature density also contributes to a high amount of flow here. This doesn't have the same sort of flow as this script here, and that it allows your eyes to move that way, but it's a very fast to read script because your eyes don't actually have to deviate very much at all from just going straight across. The direction of movement is aligned with the direction of the component features, the component line features of the script. This is a very fast and very flowing script in that sense. Another thing you should pay attention to in the construction of your scripts is how you utilize breaks, all sorts of breaks. breaks between words, breaks between lines, between sentences or clauses, even paragraph breaks can be important, though most scripts don't actually focus on that. Breaks are necessary, they provide sort of necessary mental divisions and pauses within a script. Is that the fact that there's empty space between one word and another gives sort of a mental segmentation of those words being distinct. There are some scripts that I've encountered that actually use a character for the space. And so all you see when you look at that script is you see a line of characters and a line of characters and a line of characters. And there's no mental break for the eye to sort of parse those into individual words. It's very hard to do. However, hypothetically, once you learn the language, you should be able to identify those rather quickly. Still, it does provide sort of ease to the eye, and these mental divisions are very useful. Put spaces in your text, space out your words, space out your lines, space out, if you want to, you can explore this, space out different clauses or sentences using this kind of break, so that you can, just in the same way that you're trying to distinguish words as separate ideas, you can distinguish clauses even as maybe even more distinct separate ideas in the same way. So I encourage you all to think creatively about your punctuation in this matter. Use breaks if this is the effect that you're trying to achieve, and be conscious of how much complexity there is in your various forms of punctuation. And finally, is this fine? Yes, this is fine. There are certain sort of overarching structural features that can lend a lot to a script. Not all scripts have these, but you should consider using these. If you don't have this kind of feature in your script, it doesn't make a huge difference, but if you do, then that is going to be almost entirely the perception that people have in your script, is that overarching shape. You can see a few here. In particular, this one up here, that's sort of a unique one in which each sort of individual word has this curve over the top of it, and that's the first thing you see when you look at that script. That's the only thing that you see when you look at that script before you've actually learned it, and know to look for all the details underneath. I was thinking, if you guys can do a little thought experiment, imagine what that script would look like without those overarching bars. It would look completely different. Essentially looks like I don't know, maybe a heart beating or an EEG or something. And then, of course, we have our lovely Hindi over here, where you've got your overbar. Different languages can add an overbar like this one, which concentrates your eye on sort of that effect of that single bar. We've got, this is actually from my own script here, the first one, my own script, Ryonic, that has an underbar, but it's maybe hard to notice, but it is still an important feature of the language that you notice that underbar. You notice that it has an underbar, and then the other structural feature that this has, these words don't demonstrate as well as they could, that it has this overall zigzagging pattern that alternates between consonants and vowels. It has this zigzag pattern that also governs how our eyes perceive the script. And the one on the left is an example of sort of another one of the, I don't know what it's called when it's a vertical script. I want to say underbar, but maybe middle bar or something, right bar. It's a bar that's slightly interrupted, just like with Ryonic on this side, and that provides sort of direction of the script, and it provides sort of that central structural feature that's the first thing that your eyes are drawn to. So I like to provide a little rule of thumb, a little bit of advice. Keep in mind that about 80% of the impression of your conscript comes from the 20% most frequently used characters. Choose wisely. If you're only going to use my advice on 20% of your characters, make it the 20% that are most frequently used, so that makes a more natural constructed script that gives the impression that you want it to do. Those lesser used letters, while they're important, are not nearly as important for the sort of overall first impression of your script. Another thing that you guys can look at is sort of featural matching. A lot of languages do this. This is very popular, especially with all forms of phonetic scripts, is to have it where letters that correspond to very similar phonemes, phonetically similar sounds, have very similar shapes to the letters. An example of this in alphanumeric would be the letter B and the letter P. This is very common, and this is something that you can use to, if you do this, it highlights the fact that those letters are pronounced very similarly. If one has a particular length and a particular way of being pronounced, then this accentuates the fact that those letters are essentially the same with only some very slight differences. However, if you have a language that has lots of inflection, or lots of nuance, or lots of tonal qualities, then you should potentially consider avoiding this kind of featural matching. Because if you were to do this, and you have two letters that are technically maybe under the most basic IPA look very similar, but they're not actually because they have nuanced pronunciation. Giving them this kind of featural matching would give the readers of your constructed script the idea that they actually are the same when they in reality are not. So consider this when you're creating a script, because it could affect pronunciation from people that are reading your script instead of hearing spoken language. It does affect that. Other features that I have not covered here, this is a much shorter list than I should have here, but the varieties of writing system, whether using Alphabet or any one of the other writing systems, does not seem to, except for the fact that there are all the other things I've already talked about, that decision in itself doesn't make a huge difference in perception of your script. So you can try it out and correct me if I'm wrong there. And then the direction of the writing does not seem to have, again, with left to right, right to left, top to bottom, bottom to top, any one of the linear writing systems, the direction of the writing doesn't actually change that first impression a whole lot. It is the other shapes and how they correspond to that direction of the writing do make a huge difference. So these are completely free to experiment, and plenty of other things. Anything that I haven't mentioned is up there. Anything I have mentioned, that one's free to experiment. So now I'd like to talk about my own personal script family that I've created called Ryonic. And since I think we're running sort of short on time here, I will not take you through all the boring details of how everything works. Just know that it is a featural script that classifies vowels and semi-vowels as sort of triangles on the bottom, upward pointing triangles, and all the vowels fit inside a downward pointing triangle. And that the construction of the script is basically alternation of those consonants and those vowels, and then the combination of vowels into diphthongs, triphthongs, etc. So here's an example of Ryonic blades in action. You can see it has a very angular look to it. I don't know what sort of society you correspond that to. I created it for English, so I don't actually have a society that is compared to besides English. And this is the first script that I have published on Omniblot. But and you can see this has a very, very angular, very definite look to it. But if you change just two rules about the script, just change two rules. You try to curve the letters, and then you remove the dot diareses and replace them with either lines coming out or loops at the end of the letter. You get an entirely different look of a script. So this is just to show sort of the power of, if you have one script, it's actually really, really easy to change it into something that looks entirely different. I mean, as you can see, I'm going to change those two features. Has a completely different look to it. It's curved, it's still segmented like the one above. It's lost entirely that zigzag pattern like the original Ryonic had. And this is just the tip of the iceberg with the Ryonic family. So as you can see, there are a number of different forms of Ryonic that break different rules. Each one of these is constructed by breaking only one or two rules of its sort of parent scripts. I created Ryonic blades, the one on top first, and then there's those three that come from it. This one right here is the one on the bottom that I just showed you, and there are a number that branch out from there. So this is just sort of as sort of a case study, a demonstration of the fact that you can just change a few very small things, and it can make an enormous difference on what your script actually looks like. And you would want to sort of customize this to make it look like the kind of script that you want to have. And I believe we actually do have time for me to get into non-linguistic scripts. So as I said before, if it's important for the society that you're creating a language for, you might want to consider creating a script for something else besides purely language. You might want to be doing with mathematics, or chemistry, or all sorts of sciences, even ones that our current society does not have a script for, or music, or a variety of things. If it's something that's important, very frequently used, very, very important to society, then you might want to consider adding in a script for for any one of these things. And so, as an example, I'd like to look at the mathematical script that I created, and as far as I know, it's the first Conlang. I don't know if that's actually a real word, but it works for me. I created this one for English, although English, since this one here on the left is not mine. Sorry, this one here on the left is the standard mathematical notation for a particular identity. But then if you do this in my script, it's like that. So you can have a lot of creativity with these things and figure out different ways of changing up the mathematical script you have all the same options available to you that you have when you're messing around with sentence structure, your Conlang. There's this one actually here. If you consider our sort of standard mathematical script, you can consider that as sort of subject, verb, object, because you've got the multiplier times what's happening, the function, just sign or whatever, and then what it's actually acting on. Our current mathematical script does have a subject, verb, object structure, whereas mine over here does not have that structure. It has subject, object, verb. You can play around with these things as much as you want. You can make them you probably should make them a similar structure to Conlang that you created, or you can experiment with that. If it's borrowed from another society that has a different sentence structure, you can consider that. All sorts of fun and variety you can have, both mathematical systems, musical systems, all variety of things that might be important to your Conlang. So thank you.
Great job. Okay.
Slide number 7.
First of all, I want to thank you for that really lovely description of the neurological aspects of language. I think that what you are doing here is your suggestions work on a kind of an ideal level. And the thing is that there's a vast majority of people who read alphabets very, very easily that do not follow these rules at all. And so many conlangs attempt a kind of a naturalism, and many conscripts attempt a kind of a naturalism too. So I just wanted you to take that into consideration, that while this is a lovely, this is a wonderful suggestion and a great thought experiment, but none of my scripts follow this at all, and I'm just wondering if that makes them unreadable. I really don't think so.
Okay, so it's not that it makes them unreadable to use this. In fact, you should probably deviate from this. But my idea in giving this presentation about presenting these facts is that if you're going to change from sort of this most natural form, you can and you probably should do that, but those should be conscious decisions. Is that if you wanted to have a particular feature or disobey a certain rule, you should probably look, or you can look into that, into breaking that particular rule for a reason, instead of just going sort of willy-nilly about it.
Willy-nilly about it. Willy-nilly about it. I mean, some of us start these things when at a very early age, and that becomes the way that we read it.
I think the issue that's being lost here is that the motivation for many, if not, well, I won't say all, but for many conlangers, motivation regarding the look of their script is artistic before getting to efficiency, flow, etc. If we can achieve that, great, wonderful. And in fact, it might be a design goal. But the primary design goal for many conlangers, I think, is an artistic one. How cool does it look to me, or for my or as a reflection of my con society or speakers, and that its flow, efficiency, speed of interpretation is a secondary goal, or maybe not a goal at all.
It's also the same with natural languages, with a natural script.
Well, I don't know about that, because I mean, look at a script like Tamil, at least in its standard form. It's an absolutely gorgeous script to look at, but do we really think that the people who created Tamil originally, or derived it from Devanagari or wherever it came from, were thinking first and foremost, let's make this look cool? Or were they thinking along the lines of your presentation about what will work best for our language? And then later, hey, let's try to make it artistic now that we have the script. So I think there's a different motivation operating for natural languages and the scripts that come from them versus conlang scripts. I think artistry has got to be part of the equation for conlangs.
All right, I know just what we're talking about, which is reading efficiency. And I'm wondering if you've given any thought to the visual distinctness of the glyphs. Because because I know that research has found that in some languages, let's say Hebrew, where there's really similarities between pet and pet, it slows the reading speed down. And I'm wondering if you've thought of things, and I'm thinking the equivalent in coding during the handing distance, where all the letters or glyphs are distinct, making them easy to recognize, or at least not to confuse with other letters. And if you've thought about that in terms of the optimization of the efficiency of the script.
Okay. So that is at sort of a different level of cognitive processing than I'm talking about here. What I want to look at here is sort of just the first level of visual processing, looking at just sort of subconscious, precognitive processing that we do that just sort of gives us a general feel for what the script is like. Now there's a lot of leeway in what can be done here. I'm not writing any particular set formula for exactly what shapes you should use for visual letters. As I showed with Ryonic, you can create whatever script that you want so that you have the base forms for each of your letters. But then you can change that to achieve certain effects. If you want it to flow smoothly, if you have a language that's a very flowing language, you can try to achieve that by using these certain principles. If you have a very rough, guttural language, you might want to start with whatever script that you have, but then try to use some of these techniques to make it more halting.
I think it's fascinating what you've brought today, and a lot of stuff for me to think about in the future. I was wondering, these principles regarding best practices, how many natural languages follow these with specifically like the Latin alphabet, which has been very robust and successful? Is it considered very optimal? And are there any NatLang alphabets or alphabets or whatever that do this exceptionally well?
Okay. I would say that alphanumeric actually does not do a very good job at achieving these things. There have been a lot of people that have gone, and this is what I was doing for the longest time before I got involved with Conlang, is looking at different ways of making alphanumeric more efficient. Because there are a lot of built-in inefficiencies. It's an acceptable script, but there are ways to make alphanumeric to make it better for certain purposes. And a few of these I'm sure you're familiar with. Cursive writing is a way of making it more efficient to write. Print writing is a way of making it more easy to read. And then as I showed, there are those shorthand scripts that we use to make it way easier to write and much harder to read. So I'd say that most natural languages, I don't think go about it with this process because it's far more of an organic process where the language, the script as with the language is evolving over time. Things are changing. It's a lot that comes down to individual handwriting or in the computerized age, the font that we're using that changes these principles. Because you can make a system based on alphanumeric where you have all the letters slanted or where you have all the letters that only use straight lines instead of curves. You can change that stuff about it. It's still the same system.
Natural language.
What was that?
Examples of natural scripts.
Yes.
What about Korean? Does Korean meet your ideas very closely or not?
I suppose I would say that it meets some of them, but Korean definitely doesn't achieve the flow factor, in part for different reasons. In part by the fact that when you're looking at the individual characters, once you have a really, really good knowledge of Korean, then you're going to probably end up reading each individual character like that and going to the next one. So that's an inefficient eye movement process, just to start with. If you're going for efficiency. And I suppose that when I think back about this, when Korean was constructed, because it's one of those languages one of the scripts that was, I should say, then that was, I suppose, one of the features that was in mind. Some of those features were, I suppose, well captured, but there are still a lot of inefficiencies with the Korean writing system as a
So when you're trying to evolve or trying to create a naturalistic language and you're sort of evolving it, one of the things you can do is take your base language and apply rules that we see used in regular languages. And these rules tend to be conflicting. They kind of have several different drives, distinctness versus, ease of speech and things like that. Do you feel like your best practices are something along those lines, like the sort of thing that if a script was evolving over time, it might use these essentially as like with the ease of processing, that would be something that a natural script might actually use, not consciously, but that.
I suppose that's sort of what I'm getting at here, is that there is, well, any script that's evolving over time, just like the language is evolving over time, it might have a different objective. So there might be certain scripts that evolve over time to be more efficient to write, because writing is particularly important to that society. There might be ones that, okay. There might be a certain society that has their script evolve in such a way that it makes it more efficient to read, or that makes it that different scripts might have different driving purposes. But this hopefully touches on several of those purposes that you might use to sort of create sort of an evolutional process for any particular script.
I had a comment again for just the last couple of questions. I've seen a paper, I'll have to try to find it, on the development of the Roman script from Roman times when it was all uppercase to lowercase, and it's been, found that a bunch of patterns of various things that had calcified and what the shapes of the lowercase letters mean and correlate with their words. For instance, A, E, I, O, U in lowercase all have no ascender, descender, P, T, K, B, D, G all do. And they all have a big bar-y thing, which correlates with what you were saying about their stops, they're abrupt, right? So probably there is something to this.
Cool. Oh, sorry.
I had a sort of related thing, which is something that I think that you glossed over, and actually the presentation on fingerspelling glossed over a little bit, which is that you're analyzing it at the level of individual letters. And the presentation on fingerspelling, which was great, was analyzing it at the level of individual allomorphs for fingerspelling, for allo hand shapes. I don't know. But when we process it visually, there's actually great neuro experiments on this as well. We tend not to process individual letters. We tend to process it as a gestalt. And therefore, a counter thing to optimize for is that the word shape be have some sort of shape to it all, because that's how you can process some crazy sign of a lot of fingerspelling. That's the same way that you can process the word questions if it were super fuzzy. And that's a counter constraint on what you were doing.
Okay. So.
Regarding gestalts?
Yes, thank you. Okay, so yes, if you look at human eye movement patterns, they do tend to look not even quite word to word, but it's every couple of words the eyes will fixate for a moment. But the idea is that the way in which we cognitively shift attention is different from the way we actually make eye movements. So we can shift our attention very quickly to a number of things with a time lag on our eyes actually not making it to any of those, just sitting in one place. And because the amount of time, there are models of this, because the amount of time it takes to shift attention is proportional to the distance away that it is, this results in sort of clumping behavior in where your eyes look. Is that even if you are moving attention individually to every feature or every single letter and doing that very quickly, then your eyes would still demonstrate sort of the emergent property of looking in one place while things are close to it, and then jumping to another place while things are close to it, and then jumping to another place, which is what we do see in eye tracking experiments.
I think this is probably going to have to be the last question.
Okay, your presentation was really interesting. It's definitely something to think about. But you touched on Korean, and I'm a native Korean speaker, and you called it inefficient. But I feel like that's only looking at one aspect of it, and you're kind of like too focused on the efficiency part, and then you have to read it quickly or stuff like that. And I feel like Korean, in a way, it's very phonetic, and you can translate any language into Korean very easily phonetically. Opposite to English, for example, and it's kind of like hard to romanize things in English. It's much harder than it is in Korean. So I think you should like kind of like look at it that way and kind of research on what aspect you want to focus on. Because you might say it's enough vision to read, but Korean in its way is very suitable for our language and how to pronounce stuff. So I mean, like, I feel like you're kind of too focused on one aspect. I think you should focus more on like several different aspects, and one of which should be like how appropriate it is for your language. And sometimes maybe, let's say, efficiency might not be like best way to go about in your language. You might want to like kind of slow down, and that might be your purpose.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jasper.